Today's story is Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. Have you got your books ready? Well, if so, let's begin. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so on it went. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of house. One morning, Mr. Greedy woke rather early than usual. He'd been dreaming out food as usual, and that he had him wake up feeling hungry as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, 3 slices. Eggs, 3 boiled. Toast, 4 slices. Butter, 1 dish. Marmalade, 1 pot. When he'd finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfying smile, and thought, that was a delicious breakfast, he thought to himself. Now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch. He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked, when he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. I don't remember seeing that before. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to explore. He entered a dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep, very difficult to climb, but with much huff and puff, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was without doubt the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So, Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack of the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house. The chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere on the top of the gigantic table was the most delicious food smelling Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Mr. Greedy sniffed again and decided they must get up to the top of the table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult and took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. It was bigger than him. And Mr. Greedy began to bite out on one of the apples. Then he looked around. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of the delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossus plate. And on the plate, a huge, enormous, gigantic, colossus sausage the size of a pillow. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossus potato the size of a beach ball. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossus pea the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across to the table towards the plate, and Mr. Greedy began to eat. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant's hand and looked into the eyes of a real, living giant. And who, thundered the giant, are you? Mr. Greedy was so frightened he could only just manage to squeak his name. Mr. Greedy, he squealed. The giant laughed and laughed and laughed at Thunder. Greedy by name, greedy by nature. Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson. And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on the huge, enormous, gigantic plate. And when he'd finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he had burst in any minute. Now, said the giant in a much quieter voice, do you promise never to be greedy again? Oh, yes, moaned Mr. Greedy, I promise. Well, very well, said the giant. Then I will let you go. Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat and extremely miserable. And do you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? So, if you know anybody who is greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Beware of giants.